So when Tom asked me to do this, he presented it as a kind of launching of well, an announcement of the grand festival of reciting Herodotus. So this isn't really a formal paper, it's just some thoughts on some of the practical issues that are involved in recreating how Herodotus was performed and what the reception of those performances in their contemporary context might have been like, or what are some things we should think about in relation to that. While Ivan will be speaking on the testimony for public performance of Herodotus, what I'll be focusing on are the private performances. That is what I would say the private readings of the histories that are presupposed by the existence of the written text. I do discuss some of these issues in a forthcoming article that's called The Histories in Context and its Reflections on Publication, Reception, and Interpretation, which is a Festschrift for Reinhold Wickler. There, I address more fully two questions which are relevant to the subject of reception, which I'm only going to note here in passing. There are huge questions having to do with when and how Herodotus' histories became known to his contemporaries. And unfortunately, there wouldn't be time in these 25 minutes to talk much on that. But so on dating, I'm afraid I won't say anything about dating the histories because it would take us quite far away from the subject of performance. Apart from noting that the few and late sources for Herodotus' public performances that do provide a date locate them in the mid-440s. Of publication, I'll say little also, but a little more, since despite our best efforts, the word always seems to conjure up, despite ourselves, notions of appearance of a work at a single moment and in a particular form. But at its most literal level, publication refers simply to that act of putting things into the public domain. And with Herodotus, we are compelled to discuss two forms of publication, namely those public performances which Yvonne will discuss, and also the circulation of a written text or texts. And in each of these cases, each of these formats, we have to factor in, at least theoretically, that what was made public at any given time was either parts of what came to be the histories in our possession, however revised to fit the context of that whole, or the whole history itself. And much of this, is really theoretical. I mean, what we have is the final text and some testimony about performances. But we don't really have evidence for pre-circulation of parts as such, without huge arguments having to be mounted. Here, what I want to do, instead of thinking about the dichotomy of oral versus written publication, I'd like to think more in terms of performance that's either public or private. This is both to fit in with today's theme, but also because it provides a model for multiple moments and modes of the text's reception. And these moments and modes might either be public and oral, a text heard perhaps once but not seen, or private, as in read aloud in a smaller company of individuals who have some, perhaps even unlimited, access to a written text. And in particular, I want to consider the implication of this model for interpretation, that there can be public and private and representing different kinds of access to the text. I think I would stress, though, before I go into that these private performances, what I'm calling performances, that is the readings of the histories, in select company or alone, they have to be considered the final aim of the work. I mean, how its ultimate performances were imagined as it was composed. Such audiences, and I'm using the term audience, there's no good word to embrace readers and people who are listening in public performance, but such audiences would certainly belong to the future. But despite much uncertainty about book culture in the late 5th century, we can be certain that they also belong to Herodotus' present time. An audience of readers was both the historical reality and it's one presupposed by the monumental text itself. So I'm going to call such acts of reading the histories, particularly by a group, performances, for reasons which I'll go into below. I mean, the first is stylistic. The orality of aspects of the text's self-presentation. While this stylistic feature perhaps represents the text's actual evolution through oral public performance, its appearance in a written text is an affectation, whether it's a holdover from some real evolution or it's just invented. And it represents an authorial choice, a stance fostered by the text that keeps the idea of a narrator's oral performance before the reader's eyes. I mean, it's not consistent because sometimes he does mention himself as writing. Now, this orality may be a pseudo-orality, as Fowler calls it, but clearly a feature of written prose of this period was the importation of various devices designed to catch and hold the attention of an oratorical audience. This is what Turner, in his seminal article on book culture, termed a publicist technique. So it's fair enough to think of the reading aloud in private as a performance, and even one might even stretch it to smaller groups or even one's own private reading. The second reason I think of private reading as performance is that we can put together various bits of contemporary evidence that suggests the term is not inappropriate. That is, descriptions of scenarios in which select groups attend the recitation or reading of texts, whether by the author or by another, and no doubt are able to engage in discussion of what they hear. And this is material I have on the handout in 1B, although I can't seem to make my slides move. Sorry, my slides are not moving. Wait, here, I've got it. So such vignettes appear in the Socratic writers, but would hardly have been unique to Socrates' circle. And these texts allow us to conjure up some image of the intellectual culture of the late classical period, at least at Athens. So you can take the example of the Platonic Axiocus, where Socrates repeats to the title character a recent epideixis he heard Prodicus give, probably of Prodicus's Horai, in the house of Callias. This was an elite audience, to be sure, given Callias, how wealthy Callias was. And he brought in the author to attendance. And as the passage that I put on the handout mentions, that Prodicus doesn't really do anything without money. But that's kind of one scenario. But we also have the scenario in the Platos Parties, where we're told about Socrates going to the house of Epitheodorus because they want to hear Zeno's writings. The books had been brought to Athens by these people, and Zeno himself was there to read aloud. And Socrates was there to, be able to ask him to read again and to ask him questions about the content. Now, in these two cases, it's the author who performs his text, but elsewhere in Xenophon, we have Socrates speaking of reading together with his friends, such as we find in Memorabilia, and sort of extracting. No doubt one performs the text, as in reading it aloud to the others, while others listen and they extract together what they find of value. Now, I find these things useful in thinking about the private audiences of Herodotus's text. And once you start thinking about these private audiences, I started thinking about the idea of stratification, like that there are differences between just hearing something one-off performed continuously and hearing something in intimate company with a text when one can ask questions, discuss. So I want to focus a little more on how these different types of performances of the histories of public and private may have impacted upon how their audiences received the text and the extent to which those differences are an intended feature of the work. So I've come to understand that a feature of the work has to do with this stratification of its audiences or readers, a differentiation among them based on variable capacities of recognition and interpretation. The text presupposes such differentiation to exist among its audiences, I would argue, and I would go further to say it has in many cases been designed to create such differentiation. And for the rest of the time I have, I'd just like to develop what I mean by this idea and how ultimately it was both Herodotus and Thucydides who suggested to me its importance in approaching their texts. Now, so just thinking about the practical side of this, stratification and the reception of Herodotus's logoi would most obviously in the first instance have been predicated upon the type of access one had to them, what kind of performances of it to which one was privy. Access to them can only have occurred through two channels, I mean, in the absence of owning a text oneself, one might listen to performances, whether by the author or by another in possession of the text. These may be public, as in the Testimonia Ivan will discuss, or it could be private, as in listening to someone read aloud, as might happen amongst philoi, as symposium, or in the kind of scene depicted in the opening of Plato's Phaedrus. And in the case of private performances, no doubt some informal discussion would have accompanied the reading as part of the entertainment. Johnson's recent article of 2000 discusses this quite a lot, or Henry Spellman's article, all this should be on the bibliography. So that's one scenario, is to be able to just listen to it without owning a text oneself. But one might also be able to peruse a written text, whether one owns it or has access to it, as Phaedrus does in the Phaedrus, because he borrowed a copy from Lysias. And in turn, this latter possibility presumes the existence of an owner with whom one has some connection. In such a voluminous work as the Histories would have been an item of considerable value. That owner would either have had to be a philos of no small means, or a person with whom one engages in some financial transaction. But in both cases, given the book's status as essentially a luxury item, an environment of affluence would be presupposed for those communities of readers, those private performances. Now, I'm no expert on the subject of books there, and then there are people in this audience who know more than I do. But our ignorance of the details of book production and circulation in the 5th century is unfortunately nearly complete. But a text as large as Herodotus seems unlikely to have been readily for sale as such in any quantity, if at all. By far, it's more likely as a scenario that copies were commissioned on an individual basis. The creation of a copy would presume two conditions, access to some form of the text and also wealth. Access to the text might be imagined to arise either directly from the author or indirectly through some number of personal or commercial intermediaries. And whichever of these channels happen to have been the case, they both ultimately imply a certain degree of elitism beyond that already implied by the capacity and desire to read such a text. And this elitism would be drawn along lines defined by wealth and or philia. Now, returning to performance, where members of Herodotus's audiences fell on that spectrum marked at its ends by having unrestricted access to a written text, or as having been a one-off audience of the text in performance, public performance, would already have impacted upon the degree to which they may be able to plumb the depths of interpretation of his work or any work, presuming, of course, they possess both the capacity and the will to do so. I think it's kind of useful here to think about the distinction made in our late 5th century sources in several places between performing a text straight through without interruption and being allowed to question. An egregious version of this is in Thucydides' Melian Dialogue, where his Athenians talk about the reading straight through, or the speeches that are given in the assembly, as the style that deceives the ear of the multitude by seductive arguments they're allowed to pass without refutation. By contrast, the private performances that I've been talking about allow the possibility of passages reread, as Socrates asks of Zeno, and the auditors are able to take up points that the text raises. So that's already a kind of distinction that we can have amongst listeners. Now, I find no problem in imagining Herodotus' text being read aloud between friends or in a sympathetic context where a group of like-minded hetairoi could exchange comments on what they heard. One might think of the discussion of Simonides in Plato's Protagoras, where Protagoras offers to recite first the whole if anyone should require it. Of course, he's doing that from memory, not from a written text, but I don't think that matters so much at this for this point. Moreover, the symposium provides a context of performance quite at home with the style of the ainos, the ainetic discourse, that in my view, Herodotus expected his privileged readers to engage in. If anything, we must imagine that interpretive contexts based on a shared reading of books were more constitutive of groups and group identities, and certainly more socially oriented than those we find ourselves in as modern readers, even as modern academic readers. The object of the book as a cultural commodity fundamentally changed with the capacity to mass produce written material cheaply. But by contrast, these earlier cultures attest to the status of the actual physical object of the book. A focal point for members of a group that could unite them, whether read together or as a valued possession lent to philoi to be read elsewhere and copied. So access to these private performances of the histories constitutes then the first level of stratification in its audience's capacity to interpret the text. That's not to say you can't hear the text one off and have a brilliant interpretation of it. It's just, the likelihood of getting more from the text is increased if you can keep consulting it and go back and forth within the work rather than just hear it performed straight through in one direction linearly. But stratification also results from such factors as the reader's ability to interpret and their inclination to do so. And here, both Herodotus and Thucydides address with greater or lesser explicitness the issue of how their works will be received, as well as what it means to be active, engaged, discerning readers. Thucydides' poem makes this clear when he speaks of his contemporaries having poor knowledge both of their own history and of the contemporary practices of others. So he talks about people thinking the tyrannicides killed the tyrant, or thinking the Spartan kings have 2 votes, or the Pitonate Lacos exists. The many, he concludes, at the end of that chapter, are just simply too lazy to really seek out the truth, and they'll accept whatever they're told out of convenience. So in the text itself, he is kind of writing in that there are different levels of ability and knowledge that will stratify his readers. By contrast, or maybe only his readers will be the elite. I mean, he's flattering them as well, but it is an acknowledgement that not everybody is on the same page or has the same abilities or knowledge when they come to a text, or the same inclinations. By contrast, Herodotus's work makes the point of stratification implicitly, yet pretty relentlessly. One could embark right now on an extensive discussion of the function of oracles in the histories and scenes of their interpretation and misinterpretation as an analog of the history's audiences or readers who find themselves confronted with texts that they too must interpret. So, I mean, that's a huge subject, but one need only cite the first and programmatic logos of the histories, that of Croesus, but necessarily more briefly than such a rich and paradigmatic story deserves. But I mean, in this company, it's the most embarrassing to speak about it. But the central moment of the story, the moment in which he makes the decisive error, occurs precisely when he has to interpret an oracle, a sema, as Greeks might call it. That is, he has to interpret a text. Semata is another word for writing, about an arche. So there he is getting a text about an arche, and he has to interpret it. If Croesus wages war against Cyrus, the great empire will fall. The Lydian king's ambition blinds him to one possible interpretation, and unfortunate for him, it's the correct one. He fails to recognize an inherent ambiguity in the text he receives. Arche is a signifier that can have more than one referent. And the arche he hears described can and will denote none other than his own. So Croesus is the reader or an auditor of a written text, or a text that comes to him from Delphi, who understands what he wants to understand. He understands an endorsement of his own point of view. He's not one who engages critically with what the actual content of the text holds, so as to recognize its ambiguities and potential for other construals. Now, what this story would yield to its auditors hearing it live, perhaps only once, the composite story of Croesus, could quite likely be very different from what those enjoying the text's private performances in their self-selected groups might find. If, for instance, we should locate these performances that I'm talking about, the public and private in Athens, for instance, there could well be stratification along the lines of whether one went away from listening to the Croesus story to a public performance of this logos, having heard a celebration of the native wisdom of one's own Solon, and seen a barbarian king who doesn't understand Delphi and how Greek worship works. But a smaller group in Athens, more critical perhaps of the arche or certain behaviors, could engage with this whole story and might revisit the Solon Logos, so be able to go backwards and reread and things. After Croesus on the pyre tells Cyrus that Solon spoke not only to him, but to all mankind, and especially to those who seem to themselves to be eudaimones. And that group might recognize, whether with anger, if they disagree, or agreement, if they're sort of people who might be involved in political unrest at the end of the 5th century, that what was being said about Croesus had relevance that was far closer to home. So, Herodotus actually says in his poem that he's going to begin his account by indicating through signs the man who first wronged the Greeks, using the verb semeino. Now, with semenos, the participle, a parallel is drawn between Herodotus's own mode of communicating with his audience and the mode of communication employed by the Delphic oracle, as Heraclitus so famously describes it. The Lord whose oracles in Delphi neither speaks nor hides, but gives signs. And so what I would say, just, in this kind of contribution, is that just as Herodotus depicts an assembly publicly discussing the meanings of an oracle, I think we're entitled to imagine a community of readers in their private performances discussing his text, and what they conclude might at once be at odds with what the many get from a public performance, but also closer to the dianoia, to use the word that's in Plato's Ion, of the author. So I guess I would just throw that on the table, as this differentiations in performance can lead to different interpretations based on the access to the text. So that's my contribution.
Thank you very much. So I am actually going to talk about Herodotus' alleged own performances of the histories, as well as the later performances and reception of his histories in the Hellenistic age. This is more of a collection of sources and discussion rather than a proper paper, but I am looking forward to the discussion later on for your own impressions and thoughts. The most important testimony for Herodotus' performances at Olympia is clearly contained in the opening chapters of Lucian's Herodotus, which is number 1 in the handout. He starts by pointing out the beauty of Herodotus' language and the difficulty of imitating his style, which is quite unique among ancient writers, and is probably the reason why we still read his histories today with great profit and pleasure, apart from the content, of course, of the histories, which is equally important. Lucian states that Herodotus appeared at the Olympic Games, quote, presenting himself as a competitor for an Olympic honor, not as a spectator. Then he recited his histories, and so bewitched his audience that his books were called after the Muses, for they were 9 in number. This was the way Herodotus chose to boost his popularity, and according to Lucian, it worked. In a single meeting, Lucian continues, he won the universal approbation of all Greece, and his name was proclaimed not indeed just by one herald, but in every city that had sent spectators to the festival. Others followed his example, Hippias, Prodicus, Anaximenes, and so on. This is the last part of the quotation from Lucian. The idea that the books of the histories were named after the Muses also appears in the Elegia couplet at number 2 from the Antologia Palatina. Herodotus entertained the Muses, and each, in return for his hospitality, gave him a book. But the book division of the histories was probably a product of Hellenistic erudition, as it has already been pointed out. A similar tradition to the one preserved in Lucian is attested in the biography of Thucydides by a certain Marcellinus, number 3. Quote, it is also reported the following, that once, while Herodotus was presenting his histories, Thucydides Historias Epideicnoumenu, Thucydides was there at the lecture, the akroase, and listening to it, he began to cry. They also say that Herodotus, having witnessed the scene, addressed to Thucydides' father Olorus the following words: "The nature of your son's disposition yearns for knowledge." This is a quite famous passage, but of course its veracity is questionable. Basically, the same thing is also reported in Photius' library, in the short biography of Herodotus, and in the 10th century Suda lexicon. However, only the Suda points out that this episode took place in Olympia, Epites Olympias. So we might suppose, given the Suda's, that the Suda included derivative material in this lexicon, that it was the same tradition that we have in Lucian, in Marcellinus, and in Photius. There are other testimonies regarding performances of famous individuals at Olympia, which I have collected and number 4, and some of these have already been mentioned in Lucian's passage. I will not deal with it now for lack of time, but here are quite a number of examples. For performances at festivals, we can look into the opening chapters of Plato's Ion, number 5, where Socrates commends Ion for his success at the festival of Asclepius at Epidaurus, and recalls that rhapsodes such as Ion are, quote, necessarily familiar with many excellent poets, and especially Homer, of course, the best and most divine of all poets. When Socrates asks about Ion's feeling when reciting, he suggests a number of episodes that rhapsodes might perform. Odysseus revealing himself to the suitors at the beginning of book 22 of the Odyssey, Achilles charging at Hector in Iliad 22, 312 and following, or some other sad story of Andromache, Hecuba, or Priam. This is what we might expect from Herodotus' performances as well. So a selection of the most dramatic and memorable passages. Which passages exactly, of course, is anyone's guess. Scholars tend to accept now the fact that Herodotus did perform his work in front of some kind of audience. Simon Hornblower states tentatively, is there an alternative to the idea that the middle-aged or elderly Herodotus heard a youngish Thucydides at some time read out extracts from his work in the mid-420s? The occasion could have been sympathetic or even public, such as one of the Pan-Hellenic festivals. Olympia. He also believes that Thucydides might have recited his work as well. Nigel Wilson, too, when listing the assumptions of his work on the text of Herodotus, includes, quote, acceptance of the principle that Herodotus composed the text, which was not designed purely and simply for the still nascent book trade, but was likely to be read aloud to a large public audience or to small private groups. Not, of course, in its entirety, but in the form of selected passages dealing with particular stories or episodes. There is even the famous tradition that Herodotus read his histories at Athens, number 7. Plutarch, in his pamphlet on the malice of Herodotus, claims that some historians believe Herodotus to have read his histories to the Athenians and hence received a large amount of money. The context is the following. So Plutarch complains on the bad use of the lunar calendar in Herodotus regarding the Battle of Marathon and the Spartans' late arrival, and then argues that Herodotus had not mentioned, complains that Herodotus had not mentioned the Athenian festival of Artemis Agrotera, which was a celebration for the victory at Marathon. Then Plutarch writes, talking to Herodotus himself, and despite your special concern for Athens, you have not even mentioned the procession at Agre. Here, at least, is a point which supports Herodotus against the charge that he received a large sum of money from the Athenians in return for his flattery of them. If he had read this account to the Athenians, they would not have let it pass and would not have tolerated his story of Philippides summoning the Spartans to battle on the ninth day when the battle was over. And then he continues later on. Here is a text. And yet the story that he received the gift of 10 talents, decatalanta, from Athens on the proposal of Anytus, ex Athenon Anytu topsephisma grapsantos, comes from an Athenian, Deilus, who is quite a well-known historian. So we gather that Plutarch did not believe that Herodotus received this large amount of money, but he's almost compelled to believe his source Deilus, who is not only an aner Athenaios, but also a no mean historian at all. Deilus is an early Hellenistic historian. He was possibly the son of the Archidographer Phanodemus, so someone who was well acquainted with Athenian history for family matters, probably. And the 10 talents is, of course, an enormous fee, and this might be also due to corruption of the text. But the story is not completely implausible, as many recent commentators have acknowledged. According to Deilus, it was Anytus that proposed the reward for Herodotus because of his goodwill towards the Athenians. Or maybe was it some kind of bribery so that Herodotus would write favorably of the Athenians. Anytus is not a very common name in Athens or anywhere else. The lexicon of Greek personal names records only 3 instances of this name in Athens, including the famous politician and strategos of the late 5th century, the son of Anthemion. A brief, very brief overview of the life of Anytus, as far as our sources can allow. He held a strategia. He was a general at Pylos in Messenia in 410 or 9. Was later accused of treason because he was unable to recover Pylos from the Spartans due to bad weather. He was later on also strategos at Phyle in 404 and was a follower of Theramenes' less radical views. He defended Andocides. He was famously Socrates' accuser in 399. He's also mentioned in association with Thrasybulus in 396. Then Lysias, in one oration, a speech on corn supplies from 386, mentions another Anytus, perhaps another one, or maybe the same person, I'm not sure. And finally, Diogenes Laertius reports that he ended his days in exile. So was this the same Anytus that, according to Deilus, proposed to grant 10 talents to Herodotus? Unfortunately, since Plutarch does not give any date, so there is no certainty on the identification, and it all depends, of course, on the date of publication of the histories. Date of publication, or rather, performance of Herodotus in Athens. The story reported by Deilus and Plutarch is also recorded in Eusebius' chronological tables, where it is stated that the year before the 84th Olympiad, so this is 445 BCE, Herodotus was honored for reading his books to the Athenian council, to the Athenians, actually. The translation of the Armenian text is Herodotus Athenis libros suos legens honoratus est. The Armenian version removed actually the reference to the council, to the boule, which is, however, reported in Syncellus. And we have the text here: Herodotus historikos etimethe parates Athenaion boules epanagnus autoistas biblus. And as well in St. Jerome, in Hieronymus, Herodotus cum Athenis libros suos in concilio legisset honoratus est. So the fact, both Syncellus, of course, and Hieronymus relied on Eusebius' original Greek. The fact that it was the boule that awarded Herodotus is quite significant, and I am eager to hear your opinion on this point. And now, of course, we have a lot of inscriptions attesting public lectures and readings, acroases, by Greek historians, but all pertain to the Hellenistic age. And this is later than Herodotus, but I don't think there is any reason to deny the fact that he might have performed his work at different venues, Olympia, Athens, and probably as well private gatherings as well. And I think we should see his work as the product of a still mainly oral society in a way, as Rosalind Thomas pointed out in her 1992 book on literacy and orality in ancient Greece. There is one testimony of a theatrical performance, contested actually, performance of Herodotus Histories in early Hellenistic Alexandria. This can be found in book 14 of Athenians' De Hypnosophists, reproduced at number 8, which has been neglected for a long time because all editors tended to change the name of Herodotus of the manuscripts with Hesiod, as a pairing with Homer, following Meinecke's correction. Even though in his latest Teubner edition of Athenaeus, Doug Olson printed Herodotu, having changed his mind since his Loeb edition. I have discussed this passage and its implications in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, and so I'm not going to talk about it now, but we can discuss it later on. One last point, number 9, a papyrus, P.Oxy 2382, of the 2nd or 3rd century CE, preserves a fragment of a tragedy with the dramatization of the story of Gyges and Candaules that we find in Herodotus book 1. When it first appeared, many thought that the text of the papyrus predated Herodotus. It has, according to Lobel, a Aeschylean flavor to its language, and hence it was supposed that Herodotus used this well-known story. However, now scholars tend to think that this is a Hellenistic age tragedy, and the relation with Herodotus has now been turned. So Fantuzzi and Hunter wrote, "It cannot be ruled out that we are dealing with a Hellenistic dramatizing of the well-known story. It is possible indeed that the text of this tragedy preserved in P.Oxy 2382 belongs to the Hellenistic age, and this would imply that Herodotus' text was rearranged for theatrical performances, possibly, and it's a very exciting possibility. But time is up and I should stop, and I thank you for your patience and looking forward to the discussion.